Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this latest Fox Williams webinar on travel issues. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rhys Griffiths. I'm the partner and the head of the travel team at Fox Williams. I'm joined today by Phyllis Acheampong, who's a senior associate in the travel team. And the topic for today is going to be the latest developments in the CAA's reform of the ATOL scheme in the UK. We're aiming to speak for about 45 minutes, taking you through some of the topics on screen here, which Phyllis will take you through shortly, before we then sort of leave some time at the end for questions and answers. On that note, I'm going to pass over to Phyllis.
Thank you, Rhys. So good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be considering the latest update from the Civil Aviation Authority, or the CAA. And this is in relation to its ongoing consulting process on ATOL reforms. And as you can see on the slide, it looks like quite a lot to cover, but largely this will be split into 3 sections. I will cover this first section, which will provide a bit of background and context as to how we reached this point in the consultation process. And then Rhys is going to talk more about the latest comments and proposals from the CAA in relation to the main options for reform. And then finally, we're hoping that we're going to have enough time at the end of the session to answer any questions that you might have. So yeah, okay, let's begin. Next slide, please, Eva. Okay, so the CAA issued its latest update on the consultation process, as well as its comments, in a document which was published at the top of the year in January 2023. The purpose of the document is for the CAA to provide more insight into where we are in the consultation process. And after the first round of consultations, it also wanted to share some of its evaluations and thinking from the results. The document also makes it clear that the CAA is still seeking more views on various topics from stakeholders. And as you can see, there's still an opportunity to respond until the 24th of March this year. The responses to this latest request for information will be used by the CAA to prepare an impact assessment, which will form part of its advice to the government and will ultimately help it to finalise its decision on how to reform the ATOL scheme. One of the main messages which the CAA wants to stress is that no decisions have been taken on the final proposals for reform. But as Rhys will talk about in a bit more detail later, a clear preference for insolvency protection going forward is emerging. That being said, the CAA, together with stakeholders, are still working out the kind of impact the options for reform will have on ATOL holders. So in short, this is still an ongoing process. Next slide, please. So before we dive into the contents of the most recent document, we thought it would be helpful to do a bit of a recap of the earlier stages and perhaps explain how we got to this point in the process. So the CAA issued the first consultation back in April 2021. The consultation finally closed in August of the same year. And the CAA made it clear that the call for reform was not just prompted by COVID and the Monarch and Thomas Cook collapses. The CAA was also already in the process of carrying out its own pre-pandemic analysis in 2019. However, as we all know, those unprecedented events shook up all corners of the travel industry, and it became painfully apparent that the current financial regimes were not fit for the specific purpose of protecting customer monies. In particular, the inability to pay refunds was also identified as a significant driving factor for the reform in the first consultation. In terms of what the consultation wanted to address, there were a range of issues, with the 3 listed on the slide probably being the most significant. So that's how ATOL holders fund their operations, how customers' money should be used, or rather how they should be protected, and how the APC rates should be calculated. There were other relatively minor issues that were raised as well, but I will only mention those very briefly later. So in terms of how the reforms would take shape, a range of options were presented to stakeholders, and these were option A, having all ATOL holders use the same form of mandatory insolvency protection. So the mandatory forms would either be segregation of customer monies or using bonds. It was proposed that having uniform requirements could help to achieve a fair, simple, and consistent framework for all ATOL holders. Option B, in contrast, was more about developing a tailored approach which would give ATOL holders the choice to select the most appropriate form of financial protection for their business. So ATOL holders would be able to protect customer monies using segregation or bonds or a combination of both, provided that the cover met the mandatory minimum level of funds that must be protected. For option C, the CAA proposed moving from a flat rate APC to a variable rate, and this would be calculated using specific criteria. So for instance, the risk level of the ATOL holder and or the value of the holiday. For option D, this CAA proposed the financial markets model. That is, ATOL holders would be required to obtain financial protection cover from third-party insurance providers as a condition of taking bookings. The CAA then would review the insurance policy as part of the licensing framework. And then finally, under option E, there was a proposal to place restrictions on when customers could pay the balance of their holidays. The CAA had already stated that it did not intend to pursue this option, but did ask for further comments on it anyway. It's also worth noting that Jess in our team, and along with Rhys, produced an article back in August 2021, which summarised the key issues the first consultation sought to address. So you can find that on our website. Then in May, the CAA proposed or produced rather a document which summarised and commented on the responses it had received. You can check those out for more details, but we thought it would be helpful on our next slide to provide a bit of a brief reminder of the key responses and the outcomes from that first consultation. So next slide, please, Eva. So there were 305 responses in total, and a good range of stakeholders responded as well. So these included ATOL holders, travel agents, trade bodies, member organisations, which represented travel companies, and financial stakeholders, which included UK finance and consumer bodies. And perhaps unsurprisingly, within the ATOL holder group, the largest number of responses came from tour operators, with many of these being smaller travel businesses. So what were the key overall outcomes from the first consultation? Well, there seemed to be a general consensus that changes to the ATOL framework were necessary. In addition to this, option B was preferred over option A, so ATOL holders having the choice over which protection products to use rather than having mandatory requirements. In terms of option C, a vast majority of the respondents expressed that a variable APC rate would result in a fairer system, and that meant that less riskier businesses would not effectively be subsidising riskier ones. Option D, which was the insurance option, was not well received by most respondents. Many cited previous negative experiences with insurers, as well as concerns over the likelihood of insurers paying out. It was also noted that the availability of suitable insurance for travel companies is limited, especially post-pandemic, and this is unlikely to change anytime soon. And perhaps most interestingly, there were concerns from most of the respondents, so about 271 of the 305, about potentially segregating all customer monies received until the holiday was completed. Rhys is going to talk about this in a bit more detail later, but essentially the CAA seemed to acknowledge that it had spooked a lot of stakeholders, and it was keen to stress that total segregation was only one of several segregation options that it was considering. And just very quickly, the CAA did make some immediate decisions based on the responses received from the first consultation. These were mainly in relation to changes to ATOL agency terms and APC reporting and payment requirements. But the most significant decision was in relation to the CAA's proposal to impose restrictions on when customers can pay the balance of their holidays. So this was option B from the consultation. The responses to this proposal were overwhelmingly negative. Respondents said that they preferred to control their own payment terms and also felt that this would be detrimental to customer choice or consumer choice. So this proposal was discarded. And then finally, on this slide, the transition period for full compliance with the new ATOL framework garnered a lot of different and diverse opinions, as you can see. The general pattern from the responses seemed to be that those who already had some sort of elements of the proposed arrangements in place, so for instance, segregating customer monies, were in favour of a shorter transition time, so 1 to 2 years. But the impact of the pandemic on balance sheets was cited as the main reason for favouring longer transition periods. Okay, next slide, please. So moving on to the latest consultation, we thought that we would start by talking a little bit about the underlying drivers for this stage. The opening statements in this latest CAA document tells us that the government is heavily invested in the outcome of this consultation process, and this is for a number of reasons. So firstly, ATOL is a statutory licensing scheme. Secondly, the Air Travel Trust Fund was established by the Transport Secretary, and the costs of administering the scheme also sit with the Department of Transport. But crucially, the government has, in the past, promised that if required, it would financially stand behind the fund. In practice, that means that if another ATOL holder becomes insolvent and costs can't be met from the Air Travel Trust Fund, the government would step in and use taxpayers' money to prop up the fund. And we saw this sort of government intervention during the Thomas Cook collapse. So the government is very keen to move away from this prospect of, stepping in with supporting the fund, and where possible, have that insolvency risk sit squarely with the travel industry. These sentiments are reflected in these quotes that we've included in the slides. So you can see one from Boris Johnson as far back as 2019, and then more recently from the current aviation minister. And these issues are also specifically addressed in the latest consultation document. Okay, next slide, please. Can we have the next? Oh, we are on the next slide, thank you. Just before we get into the results and the evaluation comments from the CAA, we thought it would be worth noting that in addition to the earlier consultation responses, which the CAA considered, they also carried out some further industry analysis through third parties. So this was used to assess the practical impact of some of the proposed changes set out in the initial consultation. And one of the ways that this was done was by carrying out some consumer surveys through an external market research company. The main purpose of the consumer research was to try to better understand consumers' attitudes towards ATOL protection, as well as gathering opinions on the potential changes to the scheme. The CAA wanted to know how much consumers valued insolvency protection when purchasing a holiday, and how much that might influence what they would be willing to pay for protection. So the main results were quite interesting, but perhaps not overly surprising. So it seems in the UK, when customers are booking their holidays, their main concerns tend to be about the quality of the trip, or trying to avoid cancellations and delays, etc., rather than insolvency protection. But this is probably mainly because there is a large level of trust and a general expectation that the holiday will be delivered. The surveys also showed that for consumers, ATOL protection is associated with peace of mind, and therefore gives consumers reassurance when they're booking their holidays. In terms of the APC rates, consumers said that they did not know the cost of ATOL protection was just £2.50 per person. They assumed it was more. They were therefore comfortable with an increased rate, with £10 being at the top end and £5 being considered good value for money. Interestingly, consumers were less in favour of rates that had been calculated based on the riskiness of the holiday company, as this was said to potentially influence the consumer to only book with less risky companies. So the full findings have been published by the CAA in case anybody is interested in finding out more about those results. So in addition to this, the CAA also engaged the services of an insurance actuarial consultancy company, and they were hired to advise on how the APC rates could be calculated so that they better take into account the financial risk of the ATOL holder and the value of the holiday booking. And the purpose of the exercise was to try and work out the best way to calculate APC rates, which would more accurately reflect each ATOL holder's exposure to the ATOL system. So Rhys is going to talk about that and the outcome of that advice in a bit more detail later. And then finally, in addition to reaching out to third parties, CAA also developed its own financial model in order to try and better understand the potential and practical impact the reforms might have on different types of ATOL holders. So this included different types of different sized businesses and different business models. So OTAs versus traditional tour operators or integrated flight operators as opposed to flight-only operators. The data used to develop the model included ATOL holders' cash flows and cash positions over the last 12 months. And this was taken from sources like the APC returns and publicly available financial statements from the last 12 months. So in order to actually ensure that this reflected more kind of business as usual trading conditions, the data came from 2019 as opposed to much later during COVID or just post-COVID eras. And this all fed into the CAA's evaluation of the options for reform. And that's what Rhys is going to talk about now. So I'm going to hand over to him.
Thanks very much for this. So after having undertaken all of that work, the previous consultation, the consultancy work that Phyllis has just mentioned, there's a clear picture emerging of what the preference is for the CAA, and it's clearly segregation of customer money. And that would be mandatory segregation of customer money as opposed to bonding. And bonding would be seen to be something which may supplement mandatory segregation of client funds, as I'll come and talk about in a minute. So, I mean, some of the reasons behind this from the CAA's perspective are that they see trust accounts and bonds as actually providing an equivalent sort of level of protection. So in the event of a travel company failure and the Air Travel Trust Fund needs to get hold of money to refund and repatriate customers, it makes very little difference, according to the CAA's conclusions, whether those funds come from a trust account or whether those funds are called from a bond obligor. So in terms of the value of the security, bonding and customer money segregation is seen as being equivalent. However, what seems to be driving the decision, or at least one of the key reasons for going down the segregation route, is that the CAA perceive segregation to have a preferential impact on the working capital of companies compared with bonding. Now that may sound kind of counterintuitive when you say it, because obviously if you ring fence a lot of customer money and give it to a trustee, you take it out of the business, then you would think that that would have a detrimental effect on the working capital of the company. But I think when you read the consultation more closely, what the CAA is really thinking about is if you have to ring fence customer money in that way, in a segregated third-party account, then it requires the travel company to put more money in. So it's really the cash injection caused by client money segregation, which will improve the working capital of the company, compared to bonding, where it either has a neutral effect on the working capital of the company if no collateral is required by the bond obligors, or if collateral is required by the bond obligors, cash-backed bonding or whatever it is, letter of credit, then that's something which can't, the money which is set aside for that isn't something that can be taken into account as part of the working capital of the company. So therefore it's kind of locked away, and it's seen to have a detrimental impact on the working capital of the company. So that's the key reason. Some of the other reasons that the CAA have given for wanting to go down this segregation route are that segregation is better suited to seasonal trading patterns. So obviously, during high points of booking where more customer money is coming in, with a segregation option, the level of security will just fluctuate in accordance with those booking patterns, because more money will go into the trust account as more money is received. Whereas with bonding, obviously bonding is much more rigid. It is possible to have kind of stepped bonds, which might go up and down throughout the year, but they're less common, and the steps up and the steps down tend to be less frequent. So it can lead to situations where the travel company is either over bonded or under bonded, depending on the time of year. So segregation provides much more fluidity in terms of the security. So it's seen as being a better option for that reason. The other reason, which was given, as I think Phyllis mentioned, in the early consultation, is one of the key reasons for looking at ATOL reform is that the CAA want to improve the financial resilience of travel companies and to move away from a situation where clients' money is being used to fund the working capital of the travel company, and segregation is seen as being something which achieves that better than bonding. Because obviously with segregation, it requires customer money, either all of it or some of it, to be set aside and put in a segregated account, which is independent of the working capital of the company. So a couple of other reasons given in this latest consultation. Segregation is seen as less likely to lead to ATOL holders either exiting the market, so not selling holidays anymore, or depackaging. And what we mean by that is just selling single components on their own as opposed to putting them together in a package. And the reason given for that in the consultation is that segregation is seen as being a cheaper option than bonding. So in terms of what it would cost, segregation is preferable. Therefore, that's less likely to lead to travel companies just exiting the market or depackaging their products. And the last point made is, and this is something which was brought into particular focus during the pandemic, obviously, is that there's a concern about whether there's sufficient capacity in the bonding market for bonding to be the preferred option for ATOL protecting companies. And particularly during the pandemic, we saw obviously a lot of the bond obligors withdraw from market or reduce their exposure to the travel market. And there's a concern whether if we went to that full bonding option that was discussed in the original consultation, that there just wouldn't be the capacity there in the market. So as we'll come on and talk about later, bonding is likely only to be seen as something which will supplement segregation as opposed to be an alternative to segregation. Next slide, please, Eva. So when we talk about segregation being the preferred option, what seems to be less defined at the moment is the form of segregation. And the CAA have said that they're thinking, broadly speaking, of 4 different sorts of segregation that could happen. So total trust segregation is the first of those, and that involves setting up a trust account with an independent trustee where all of the customer money is paid and sits there until the customer complete their holiday, and then the money can come out. Now, obviously, from a financial protection point of view, that's the best option for the CAA because 100% of the customer money would be there to pay refunds or to pay repatriations in the event of the failure of an ATOL holder. However, obviously, from a company perspective, this is going to be the most difficult from a working capital perspective because it's going to mean, setting aside all of the customer money and not being able to use any of that customer money to pay suppliers, for instance, until the holiday is finished. So that's one option. Options 2 and 3 are variations of that first option. So option 2 is allowing ATOL holders, once they've paid the money into the trust account, to withdraw a certain amount of that money to pay suppliers. So that could either be by reference, so that could be allowing travel companies to pay particular suppliers like airlines. Alternatively, it could be defined by, the money you could withdraw could be defined by reference to a particular percentage or particular sum. We have escrow accounts at the moment where 70% of the customer money has to sit in a trust account. So 30% could then be used. So that's the second option. The third option would be to allow money to come out of the trust account to pay all suppliers. So you could take money out to pay the flight, to pay the accommodation provider, and to pay the transfer provider or any other providers of packaged products. Now the fourth option is one which doesn't involve setting up a trust account. It's a client accounts option, which effectively involves the ATOL holder setting up a separate bank account and the customer money being paid into that bank account, which is then overseen by a designated director of the ATOL holder, and which is then sort of audited and validated by an independent auditor, which would be the ATOL reporting accountant, potentially throughout the year, potentially at the end of the year. The sort of frequency and how that would happen hasn't been defined yet. And in terms of what level of funds need to be paid into the client's accounts, well, the options would be the same as with the trust account options. So it could either be everything, and everything would have to stay in the client account until the holiday is completed. Alternatively, some money could come out to pay suppliers, or all of the money required to pay suppliers could come out. So, the level of funds needed to be held in the client account hasn't yet been determined and is up for debate. And I think really what seems to me, at any rate, to be driving the client account option is that it would allow certain payments to be made out of the account in a broader range of circumstances than with the trust account. Specifically, whereas with the trust account, individual client payments can be taken out to pay for that client's booking with a particular airline. With a client account option, the CAA seemed to be contemplating that it would be possible to take out a big chunk of money to prepay accommodation suppliers to secure commitments at the beginning of the season. So not necessarily linked to specific customers. It could just be taken, a chunk of money could be taken out to prepay, make large prepayments to accommodation suppliers. So that, it seems to me that that's what's driving the client account option when you read the consultation, and otherwise seems to be saying that you might as well just have a trust account option. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the CAA is considering whether to use bonds or insurance products to supplement the segregation options. And I think what that's alluding to is a little bit how you have at the moment with non-flight packages protected by a trust account. You can take money out of those trusts provided you have an insurance policy in place. And I think that's the kind of thing that the CAA is looking at here, so that if we end up with one of the segregation options which allows suppliers to be paid, then there may be a requirement for those payments to be, or those monies which are taken out of the trust account to be protected by a bond or by insurance. So that's what the CAA is looking at in terms of what the role of bonds and insurance would be. And before we move on from these options, one sort of interesting point to note, there is a lot of discussion in the consultation document about how integrated operators should be treated, and whether monies ought to be allowed out of the segregated accounts to pay their sort of internal airlines. And there's an interesting note here, which I think will particularly impact maybe online travel agents, which book flights with the airlines of those integrated operators like TUI, Jet2 or EasyJet. The CAA is looking at whether payments made by those OTAs from the trust accounts to pay those airlines should be treated differently, and because of the perceived higher risk involved with those integrated operators. So perhaps, I mean, I don't know, but perhaps there will need to be some additional protection put in place by those OTAs for those payments which are made to the airlines of these integrated operators. Next slides, please, Eva. So that's the insolvency protection options. The next sort of line of thinking to emerge from the consultation is around APC and what that should be. And as Phyllis has said, at the moment, it's £2.50 per person per booking. And the CAA is looking to change that and to introduce some sort of variable APC. And what they have asked their consultants to do, that they've retained, is to better link APC payments to the risk posed to the air travel trust if an ATOL holder fails, and to determine that the risk factor of a particular ATOL holder to the air travel trust. The consultants in the CAA have identified sort of 3 factors which they think will determine the price of APC for a particular ATOL holder. And the first one is size of the ATOL holder. And they're looking there, they have been looking there particularly at passengers carried, the average value of trips, and the financial strength of the ATOL holder. And the particular metric that the consultants in the CAA have been looking at to determine when a travel company is more risky is the leverage ratio of that travel company. So the higher the leverage, the more risky. So potentially the more APC would have to be paid. Again, not committing, but giving a very clear indication of how this might work in practice. The CAA and the actuarial consultant have run some numbers, and applying this criteria, they've come out with a variable rate which will range from potentially 50 pence per person to £15 per person per booking for the absolute riskiest ATOL holder. One thing to note, which isn't on the slides, and before we click on, is there is mention in the consultation as well of maybe incentivizing ATOL holders to provide more financial protection than what their license terms require, and in return being able to get a preferential APC rate. So I don't know, I mean, let's say that as part of the ATOL renewal, an ATOL holder sets up a trust account, segregates 70% of customer money. Um, if the ATOL holder was then to increase that to 100%, then the CAA is looking at sort of rewarding the ATOL holder for providing that additional protection by reducing the APC that they would have to pay. Next slides, please, Eva. So just picking out some sort of interesting points or other points to note, and these are points that I found interesting when reading the consultation. Maybe other people will as well. The first is that very clearly, and Phyllis mentioned this earlier, that the feedback from ATOL holders to the first consultation was very clear that the majority of ATOL holders didn't believe that there should be mandatory segregation of customer monies. The majority view was that ATOL holders should be able to have some flexibility and choose the form of financial security that they provide to the CAA. So that would be potentially a situation where the CAA determines that going forwards, 70% of all customer money has to be protected, or 100%. But then the ATOL holder having the option whether to provide that security through either segregation of customer money or alternatively a bond. I mean, that was the view expressed by the majority of ATOL holders, but clearly that's not something that the CAA is minded to do. So there's a sort of a distinction there between what the CAA wants and what ATOL holders want. The other thing which I think is quite interesting is that in this consultation and in all of the work that the CAA has been doing, as Phyllis described earlier, analysing the impact of these options on different stakeholders, there's absolutely no mention of card acquirers or credit card companies. Now, under the current scheme, there is coordination to an extent between liabilities picked up by the acquirers on a failure and liabilities picked up by the Air Travel Trust Fund. And whenever there's a failure, there's the usual failure notice will go out from the CAA, encouraging customers who booked using a credit card to go to their credit card company. And there's then behind the scenes an agreement between the CAA and the card acquirers, which divvies up the loss, because the card acquirers have a liability for that loss in the same way that the Air Travel Trust Fund does. So interestingly, there's no mention of that in this consultation, which does sort of beg the question whether those arrangements are going to continue, because it would seem strange if we were to end up in a situation where 100% of customer money had to be protected until the customer finishes their holiday. But then there is also the added protection of customers being able to go to their card issuers on an insolvency. It would seem that sort of situation would seem to leave the Air Travel Trust Fund massively overprotected. So that would be a concern for me if I was a travel company. I'd want to know that costs picked up by the acquirers would be reflected in these proposals. The other thing which was mentioned in the early consultations as well, and was listed actually as one of the key drivers for looking at ATOL reform, was the need to ensure that ATOL holders could pay refunds when refunds were due. Now that first ATOL document was published in April 2021, when we were beginning to come to the end of COVID, of the worst part of the pandemic, where there had been lots of action by the Competition and Markets Authority to force travel companies to pay refunds. So the original consultation document said that there were broadly two drivers for reforming ATOL. The first one was improving the financial resilience of travel companies, reducing the reliance on customer monies, and the second one was the need to as a consequential benefit of that, the ability of travel companies to pay refunds owed to customers. And that's just something which doesn't feature at all in this new document, which has been published. So I don't know whether that's no longer a factor or whether it's less of a factor and less of a driver for this. But it's interesting to note that it's not mentioned at all in this document. Two other things. I mean, I'm not going to mention the financial markets option. That I think Phyllis has already drawn a line under that. It's very unlikely that that's going to happen. But the other point to note is that at some stage after the financial protection of ATOL holders is determined, the CAA is going to come back to this issue of pipeline monies and what can be done, what should be done to protect the money that agents of ATOL holders hold. But at the moment, the CAA are going to focus on the position of ATOL holders, and once that's determined, they'll come back to the pipeline monies issue. Next slide, please, Eva. So in terms of next steps, there's still a bit of time to respond to this consultation. Doesn't close until the 24th of March. So if you have comments or observations on any of the issues that we've been talking about today, there is an opportunity to make your views known to the CAA. And then ultimately following that, what seems to be the plan is that there will be a joint DFT CAA consultation on the preferred option for ATOL reform. So that will follow the end of this consultation. And then following on from that, depending on what that option is, there may or may not need to be a change to the regulations or a change to the other acts of parliament, which will therefore necessitate parliamentary time, which could delay the process. It also could mean that other changes get made when this gets put through Parliament that we're not currently talking about. So that's a bit of an unknown in terms of the process, but what seems to be pretty clear is that there will be some sort of transition process. It's been mentioned that that may start from April 2024, which seems ambitious, but that's what the CAA are aiming towards. Next slide, please. So that's it. That's the end of the session by me and Phyllis. So we're just going to look now at some of the questions which have come in. The first one is it fair to say that the client's account segregation option seems to be a new concession by the CAA? I think it's concession. I think it's something which was mentioned in the original consultation, and I think it's something that the CAA is mindful of because of this particular issue that some ATOL holders have in needing to make large prepayments to particularly accommodation suppliers. So it's still a potential option. I mean, obviously, many people have expressed concerns at the integrity of that sort of option compared to a trust account option, which is overseen by an independent trustee. But it does seem to be something which the CAA is prepared to contemplate. Next question, and I think this might be one for you, Phyllis. In the events that people want to make their views known to the CAA, how do they do that?
Well, there are. Can you hear me? Sorry, I've just put myself off
Yes.
mute. Okay, good. Well, there's basically three ways that you can do this. So you can input your responses via the CAA's Citizen Space page, which is an online survey tool. So you can find the link within the latest consultation document or by searching for it online. But just it's worth noting that if you do use that route, if you do have any confidential or sensitive information, that should be sent separately by email, and it should be marked as confidential or sensitive as well. If you don't want to use that page, or if you can't use that page, then you can send your responses via email or by post. And the relevant details again have been provided in the consultation document, but alternatively, let us know and we can share those details with anyone who wants them separately.
Okay, thanks, Phyllis. So another question here, quite a long one, I'll read it out. Based on what Fox Williams is hearing from his clients, do you share the CAA's view on the non-suitability of the so-called financial markets option as a complete solution and alternative to the APC levy ATOL scheme? It seems that this option has been hastily dismissed and it's not entirely justifiable since there is actual supply of ready-made complete solutions in the insurance sphere. I think the CAA's perception is that it's just not viable as a full market solution. So it's not something that kind of could be rolled out to all ATOL holders, because some ATOL holders wouldn't be able to get the required insurance or bonding. But it seems to me it is something which is an option for some travel companies, particularly those which are very well capitalized and very strong financial standing, and may even, in fact, in other jurisdictions already have these kind of bespoke arrangements which involve them retaining a claims handler and then having a set up with a bank or another funder which would provide the finance to pay refunds and repatriation. I mean, it does seem to me to be something that if I was one of those very large sort of well capitalized ATOL holders, I would want to pursue, because it may give me more flexibility, it may be cheaper for me, and a common complaint that we hear is, why should we be paying APC when in reality it's never going to be called upon. But obviously that's something that the CAA is looking to take into account with this kind of variable APC rate. So I just wonder whether it could be an option for some travel companies, and whether it's something that the CAA could allow for some travel companies to use. I mean, it's expressed its view on this, but there is a question upon it in the consultation. So if anyone does disagree with this line of thinking by the CAA, then there is an opportunity to make submissions on this particular topic and say, well, no, in fact, we are capable of sourcing insolvency protection like this. So that's that question. There was another question here, probably for Phyllis, which is, given that clients' money segregation is kind of coming down the line, what can or what should travel companies be thinking about to prepare for this?
Well, I think the first step is to make sure that you you understand how segregation processes work in practice and how these are going to potentially impact your current arrangements. So, for instance, if you set up a trust account, you may be required to pay the relevant customer money into that account, say, 2 working days, within 2 working days of receiving that money from the booking, which has been made by the customer. And that may not be realistic if your merchant acquirer defers payment for the customer funds and only releases those funds to you, say, 14 days after the booking transaction has taken place. And there may be similar issues with monies that come through sales that have been made by one of your agents. So perhaps you've only agreed that you will receive booking monies from agents at the end of each month. So those sorts of issues need to be worked out. Also, companies need to consider the ways in which segregation arrangements will limit the company's current working capital. And following on from that, some of the things the company can do to minimize the cash flow squeeze. So, for instance, you could try to renegotiate your payment or commercial terms with your suppliers where possible, or ensure that the payment requirements for the segregated account align with when you receive your customer payments from your merchant acquirer. Yeah, and it might also be worth finding out a bit more about how trust deeds operate. So this is the option, one of the options that the CAA is considering. But if you do take on a kind of trust account, then you need to work out, for instance, who's going to be responsible for what. So both within your business and on the trustee's side, and who's taking what actions. Also the costs that are associated with running a trust fund. So there'll probably be upfront costs and there will be some ongoing costs as well. So that all needs to be taken into consideration as well. And obviously as well, if the relevant sort of payment terms and withdrawal rules are really important as well, because you want to ensure that you don't breach any regulatory obligations or the terms of the trustee. So but yeah, I would probably recommend, if you feel like segregation arrangements are going to negatively affect your business, it's probably worth, setting out your concerns to the CAA in this latest consultation before the 24th of March, because your comments will be able to influence the CAA's final decision. So it would be worthwhile. So yeah, I think those are some of the things to think about.
Thanks, Phyllis. So there's a couple of questions about client account options. So I might just whittle through these and then come back to you about a question on payments to suppliers. So what is Fox Williams's views of those of clients whom you are speaking to about the less onerous client account option? I think the client, what I hear about the client's account option is that there's a degree of, I suppose, skepticism about it, in that, firstly, it is perhaps less robust than a trust account option, which is overseen by a very experienced sort of independent trustee that has to file reports with the CAA, where there's a degree of kind of independent scrutiny of what's in the account, and the trustee also has greater visibility over the comings and goings of that trust account as well. And I think the other factor, and actually I'll mention him by name because he's asked, he hasn't anonymized himself. So Chris Foti asks, would the accountancy profession be willing to sign validation reports on CAA client accounts? CAA have been unsuccessfully trying to agree a structure with the ICAEW for 7 years on reporting for existing CAA trust accounts. I think that's the other thing that sort of leaps out to me is this concept of ATOL reporting accountants kind of auditing and validating those client accounts presupposes that the ATOL reporting accountants would be prepared to do that. I can quite understand why there'd be sort of some reluctance to do that, given kind of the lack of kind of information and control over the client account. I mean, it does seem to me to be just a concept which is designed to address this situation where ATOL holders need to be able to make large prepayments to suppliers to secure, volume discounts at the beginning of a season, let's say, which is not something which is possible for technical reasons under the current trust account structure. So maybe this is a way around that. But I agree, it's kind of it's not something that I'm seeing much enthusiasm about. So that's it on the client account question. There's then one, I mean, maybe Phyllis, this is one for you with respect to payments of limited funds to suppliers. Is there any indication of what the CAA may be thinking about here?
I think we've seen in the comments from the CAA in this latest consultation that there is some they are looking at some flexibility with the segregation. So I think you mentioned, Rhys, in your portion of the slides, that there are various options which are looking at giving ATOL holders the ability to make a whole range of sort of withdrawals from the accounts where possible. And I think that was mentioned, wasn't it? Payments to suppliers, where it's going to be difficult to renegotiate, you know, your payment terms with those suppliers, or with airlines where there's no real negotiation with that. They just have to be paid up front. But I think the CAA is conscious of these sorts of issues and is taking those into consideration at the moment.
Thanks, Phyllis. Probably time for one more question. There's a very specific question here. So Rhys made a point about supplier payments from OTAs to airlines that are part of an integrated group, possibly having to be protected differently. But as far as I can tell, the CAA's paper only asks questions about payments made by ATOL holders to airlines within the same group structure. So I think where you will see this is there is a section which talks about payments made by ATOL holders to group airline companies. But then within that, at 3.15, they talk about supplier concentration. And if you then look at question 7, it talks about where there is a degree of concentration risk, and what concentration risk is the situation where there's an ATOL holder and an airline within the same group. It asks, should payments made to these suppliers be considered differently? So it's looking at the situation where payments are made by companies independent of that group to an airline where there is that concentration and that kind of integrated operator risk. So they're asking about that at question 7. And maybe just one more question very quickly for you, Phyllis. The timeline seems to be ambitious. I mean, maybe you just want to talk about the timeline, whether you think it's realistic.
No, is my response to that. I think we can just maybe look at how long it's taken to get to this point. So we started off in 2021. There was an extension even to, to respond to that first consultation. And then, May is when we got comments on that, May 2022. And then it's January 2023 now that we've now entered into the next stage of requesting more information. And as you mentioned, there's going to be a further consultation on top of this with the Department for Transport. So I think it's ambitious, but I think we also need to take into account that the CAA are aware of this, and although they are very keen to start sort of making changes in April, this transition period I think is going to be really key. And we'll have to see kind of, how long it's going to be for, but it seems like any changes will be introduced gradually, which will be good for travel businesses.
Thanks very much, Phyllis. We are 1 minute over time, so I'm going to guillotine it there. And on behalf of Phyllis and myself, I'd like to thank everyone for taking part today. We will be circulating copies of these slides and also the recording in the days that follow. And also, if there are any questions, and there are some questions that we didn't manage to answer on the webinar. We will follow up and send you an email in relation to those. But on that note, thank you very much.